SAS Interview Question and Answer, question number 48. What do you mean by SAS macro variables and what are their types? This question is asking about definition about the SAS macro variable and its type. SAS macro variable in SAS is a string variable that allows to modify the text in the SAS program. It is used to store a value in SAS which is always character and can hold character, number or text. Macro variables defined by the SAS programmer are called user-defined macro variables, and those defined by the macro processor are called automatic macro variables, which are global macro variables. We can define and use macro variables anywhere in SAS program except within data lines. User-defined macro variables are two types. First one is local macro variables. Then second one is global macro variable. Let me explain first local macro variable. When the macro variable is defined inside the macro, that means SAS macro code, then it can be applicable only in that macro and value available only until macro stops executing. Such type of the macro variable is called local macro variable. That means local macro variable is defined inside the macro code and its value is effective only inside that macro. We cannot use outside the macro. A sample code is given here. %macro ABCD is macro name. A user-defined local macro variable DSN is used, and another local macro variable XY is used with the help of %let. %let XYZ equals to 12. That means local macro variable is defined inside the macro, and we are going to print a report. Suppose title is report print local macro variable, proc print data. We are calling local macro variable DSN, where age equals to $xyz. We are calling macro variable xyz. Run macro close, and we are calling macro ABCD here, %macro, by providing SAS help.class dataset. When we run first set up the code, then we will get result as shown on the right side. The title is report print local macro variable, and from this table it is clear that age variable contains only age 12. That means local macro variable has a resolve. XYZ has a resolve. As a result, we observe this result, which includes age equals to 12. From log window, we observe there are 5 observations read from the dataset SAS.class where age equals to 12. That means local macro variable XYZ has a resolve. Let me explain about the global macro variable. When a macro variable is defined in a statement outside the macro definition or automatically created by the SAS session, then the macro variable can be used anywhere in the program and it gets removed at the end of the session. Such type of the macro variable is called global macro variable. That means global macro variable are defined outside the macro, and system defined macro variable are also called global macro variable. Sample code is given here. %let PQR equals to 14. Here PQR is user defined global macro variable where its value is 14. We are going to use global macro variable PQR inside the macro core. %macro ABCD. Title is report print global macro variable. That means we are going to print another report. And another line is printed on ampersand sysdate9. That means sysdate9 dot we are using here, where sysdate9 is global macro variable, which is system defined macro variable. Procprint data equals to ampersand dsn, we are calling dsn here, where age equals to ampersand pqr, we are calling global macro variable pqr. Run, closing macro, and calling macro by providing SAS help.class dataset. When we run second set of the code, then we will get result as shown on the right side. The title is report print on global macro variable printed on 19 Feb 2024. That means sysdate9 global macro variable has resolved because it is system defined macro variable and global macro variable, it has resolved to the today's date. And from this table, age variable shows value 14. That means global macro variable PQR has resolved inside the macro. As a result, we observe the result which includes age 14. Next step, we are going to check local and global macro variable outside the macro. First of all, I am going to check local macro variable. Procprint data SAS_help.class, where age equals to ampersand xyz, where xyz is local macro variable which is defined in previous slide inside the macro, and run. When we run this third set of the code, then it will display error message as shown on the right side. It says apparent symbolic reference xyz not resolved, because xyz is local macro variable, it cannot be resolved outside the macro. When we run the same set of the code with a SAS window, this is the first set, that is the use of local macro variable, because this %let xyz equals to 12. This is the local macro variable which is defined inside the macro. When we run first set of the code, then it will display the result exactly same as we explained before. Title report print local macro variable, and table contains or includes age equals to 12. That is local macro variable has resolved. Let me go back to the code and run second set of the code for global macro variable, where we have defined global macro variable PQR outside the macro, but we are using this global macro variable inside the macro. Let me run the second set of code. We will get the result. Title is report print on global macro variable printed on 19 Feb 2024. That means system defined global variable has resolved. And table contains age 14. That means global macro variable PQR has resolved. As a result, we get this table which contains age equals to 14. From third set of the code, we are going to check whether local and global macro variables can exist or can applicable outside the macro or not. Let me check first local macro variable. Procprint data SAS_help.class, where age equals to ampersand xyz. That means I am going to use local macro variable and run this code. Then it throws error. That means apparent symbolic reference xyz not resolved. because xyz is local macro variable and we are going to use outside the macro. That's why it cannot resolve. As a result, it is throwing error and it says that xyz not resolved. Then similarly, let me check global macro variable. I'm commenting this part first. Second part, I'm using global macro variable pqr. Let me run this code. Yes, it says the result. It displays the result. That means age is 14. From here, it is clear that user-defined macro variables are two types: local macro variable and global macro variable. Local macro variable is defined inside the macro code and applicable only inside that macro. We cannot use outside the macro. But global macro variable is defined outside the macro code, or system defined macro variable are also called global macro variable, which can be used outside and inside the macro as well. That's all about question number 48. Thank you.